The night she disappeared had been ordinary in the most dangerous way, quiet, predictable, forgettable. Streetlights hummed. A neighbor's dog barked once and then stopped. By morning, her car sat where she'd parked it, keys missing, seat adjusted just the way she liked, as if she might return any second to finish a thought. For weeks, the police moved through the rituals, tape, questions, forms. For years after, the case calcified into a file number, the kind that sinks to the bottom of cabinets and budgets. But to her brother, the silence was louder than any siren. He learned to hear it breathing at night. He studied the evidence the way some people study scripture. Every line mattered, every omission felt intentional. Fibers cataloged, but never matched. A partial shoe impression photographed poorly, then dismissed. A single strand of hair logged as inconclusive. He learned the language of labs and timelines, the limits of memory, the fallibility of eyewitnesses. He learned what cold really meant, not the absence of heat, but the presence of time. Heavy and compressive, crushing urgency into dust. When the call stopped coming, he kept calling. When the emails bounced, he showed up. He watched detectives age, watched technology sprint ahead while her case stayed still. DNA analysis evolved from blood typing to SDRs to touch DNA. He read peer-reviewed papers at his kitchen table, underlining phrases with a shaking hand. He understood contamination risks, allylic dropout, stochastic thresholds. He understood that the past could still speak if it had a mouth. The mouth was her evidence locker, and it was sealed. The unthinkable didn't arrive as a thunderclap, crept in as a calculation. If the system could not be persuaded to listen, it could be forced to hear. He weighed the ethics the way surgeons weigh risk, knowing that doing nothing was also a choice, and it carried its own body count. He told himself he wasn't chasing justice, he was chasing truth. He told himself that truth could survive a little blood. The first step was access. Access always is. He volunteered where paperwork grows tired and people assume familiarity equals trust. He memorized routines, the soft clicks of doors, the habits of guards who believed monotony was a defense. He did not steal, borrow time. A swab, sealed for decades, waits patiently for hands. He understood chain of custody as both shield and weapon. How a break could poison a result, how a perfect process could resurrect a voice. What he did next was smaller and larger than crime. He pricked his finger. A bead formed, bright and undeniable. He pressed it to cotton, careful, reverent. This was the unthinkable, not desecration, but confession. He was putting himself into the story so the story could finally speak back. Familial DNA searches work because inheritance leaves fingerprints across generations. A brother shares half the map. He became a key by turning himself into a lock. Science is not magic. It's patience with rules. He logged the sample anonymously, using protocols designed to protect the innocent and sometimes the guilty. He knew the probabilities, the likelihood ratios, the way a partial match whispers before it shouts. He knew that what came back might not be enough, that databases are oceans with blind spots, that absence can masquerade as innocence. Weeks passed, he slept badly. When the call came, it did not offer answers, only direction. A hit adjacent, a branching possibility, a man with a history that fit too neatly to be coincidence. The math didn't accuse, it suggested. That was enough. Suggestions reopened doors. He brought the result to people who had learned to say no as a reflex. He brought it calmly. He brought it with citations. He did not mention his finger, did not mention the cotton. He watched skepticism erode under numbers that did not care about budgets or reputations. Warrants followed. Then shovels. Then light. They found what time had tried to erase. Soil keeps secrets, but it also keeps promises. Bone tells stories in microfractures and isotope ratios. Teeth remember water. Its fibers cling like guilt. The suspects' denials collapsed under their own weight. When the jury heard the science, it sounded like fate, but it was method replication, controls, error margins spoken plainly. The conviction did not feel like victory. It felt like exhale. Only afterward did the question circle back to him. A discrepancy noted by someone thorough. A pause. A glance. He told the truth without ornament, explained contamination and safeguards, intent and consequence. He did not plead heroism. He accepted that rules exist because outcomes matter. He accepted the censure, the fine, the quiet exile from rooms where decisions are made. He accepted it because he had already crossed the line that mattered. At the grave, he spoke to her in the language she would have understood. Specifics. Names, dates, the way certainty can be built from fragments if you're willing to pay the price. The unthinkable had not been the blood or the breach. It had been the refusal to let a life dissolve into paperwork. Science closed the case. Love broke it open. The backlash did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It came as silence, the institutional kind that drains color from rooms. Phones stopped ringing, invitations thinned. He learned the anatomy of professional disappointment, how it hides behind policy language and neutral expressions. But the case kept breathing in public now, and breath has momentum. Journalists discovered the gap between what the law permits and what justice sometimes requires. Ethicists debated whether necessity could excuse violation, whether intention could ever launder process. He listened without participating, knowing that the argument wasn't really about him. It was about the boundary everyone pretends is fixed. He returned to the science because it was steadier than opinion. He read about kinship analysis, about the mathematics of relatedness, how likelihood ratios bloom when databases grow. He understood the dangers to how familial searching can mislead, how coincidence can masquerade as certainty when sample sizes swell. He did not romanticize the method. He had seen how isolated narratives seduce. He insisted even now that the result had not been inevitable. It had been earned carefully, step by step, by procedures that did not care who held the pipette. People asked him if he would do it again. He never answered quickly. The truth lived in variables. If the evidence had been thinner, if the probabilities had whispered instead of spoken, if a living suspect's life could have been crushed by a statistical ghost, then no. Science demands humility, and humility demands restraint.
Ow.
But the bones had spoken with clarity. The soil had corroborated. Independent labs had repeated the work and found the same answer waiting. Replication is the opposite of faith. At night, the case replayed not as triumph but as texture, the sound of latex snapping on wrists, the smell of archive paper, the weight of a swab between fingers. He did not feel absolved. He felt aligned. There is a difference. One is a verdict. The other is a posture. The community began to change its posture too. Cold cases once treated as static became dynamic again, their evidence re-examined under new light. He watched as policies shifted incrementally, pilot programs, oversight committees, consent frameworks that tried to anticipate the next unthinkable act before it happened. He was consulted unofficially, his experience hovering like a footnote no one wanted to cite but everyone had read. Families reached out, carrying boxes of grief that rattled with questions. He told them the truth gently. Science is not a wish. It is a tool with tolerances. Sometimes the answer is no answer. Sometimes it arrives late and costs more than you planned to pay. He taught them how to read lab reports, how to ask the right questions without accusing the people who might still help. He taught them patience without surrender. There were moments of doubt, a paper published challenging the reliability of certain low-template analyses, a wrongful conviction overturned elsewhere on the strength of better math. He absorbed these like weather, adjusting his internal instruments. He did not defend what he had done by clinging to outcome alone. He defended it by rerunning the logic, stress-testing the assumptions, inviting critique. Science survives contact with doubt. It dies without it. In the quiet hours, he visited the places she had loved. Memory is not evidence, but it is data of a different kind, qualitative, rich, unrepeatable. He cataloged these two privately, as if building a control group for his heart. When the ache sharpened, he reminded himself that accuracy is an act of respect. To be precise is to be kind. A lecture hall invited him, then uninvited him, then invited him again under different terms. He spoke without slides, letting the words carry the structure. He described the science plainly, then the breach without apology. He described the risk of precedent, how one person's necessity can become another's excuse. He described the safeguards he wished had existed, the consent he wished could have been asked for before desperation took over. The room did not clap. It breathed. Afterward, a student asked whether the law should bend for love. He answered with a story about bridges, how they are designed to flex under load, how too much rigidity leads to collapse, how too much give leads to failure. The trick is knowing the load before it arrives. He admitted that he had guessed, admitted that guessing had worked once and might fail disastrously next time. Honesty, he said, is not an alibi. It is a warning. The case continued to ripple outward. Appeals were filed and denied, then filed again. Each motion tested the chain of custody like a stress fracture. Each time, independent verification held. The science did not flinch. It does not know how. Watching that steadiness was its own kind of mercy. He visited her parents and spoke less than they expected. They held his hands and thanked him without condition. Gratitude is heavy. It bends spines. He accepted it carefully, distributing the weight where it belonged down to the methods, the teams, the systems that finally functioned as designed. He refused to let himself become the explanation. Explanations end conversations. He wanted them to continue. Years later, the locker room of evidence was brighter. New labels, better seals, cameras that watched without blinking. Protocols had grown teeth. He stood in the doorway during a training session and felt something like relief, cautious and conditional. Progress is a hypothesis until it replicates. A young technician asked him about contamination, about how a single cell can tilt a narrative. He explained stochastic effects, how alleles can vanish at low copy numbers, how analysts must resist the urge to fill gaps with certainty. He explained why blind testing matters, why context can bias even careful eyes. He watched the technician nod, watched curiosity harden into discipline. This, he thought, is how you repay a debt by making the next mistake harder to make. The unthinkable followed him like a shadow with soft edges. It was invoked by critics and admirers alike, flattened into slogan. He resisted that flattening. He insisted on texture, on footnotes. He insisted that no act exists without environment, that systems create incentives long before individuals create actions. If the system had listened earlier, he would not have had to shout with blood. At her grave, seasons kept count. He spoke less now, letting silence do the work. Silence can be an answer when it is chosen. The cold of the case had lifted, replaced by a different temperature, cool, stable, survivable. He learned to live there. One evening, an envelope arrived without return address. Inside was a lab report from a different family's case, a question circled in pen. He did not touch the evidence. He wrote back with guidance only how to petition, how to protect integrity, how to insist on independent review. Boundaries once crossed become maps for others. He drew his line and held it. It had become something like a cautionary tale told in two voices. In one, he was a hero who bent the world back into shape, in the other a warning about slippery slopes. He rejected both as incomplete. The truth lived in the overlap, where science meets consequence and refuses to look away. When he dreamed, it was no longer of lockers and lights. It was of water flowing over stones, patient and exacting. Erosion is not violence, it is persistence. He woke with that image and carried it into the day. The final reckoning was quiet. Policy memos circulated, citing no names, establishing a framework for familial searches under strict oversight and informed consent where possible. It was not perfect. It was something. He read it once and set it down, feeling the peculiar satisfaction of seeing a system adjust its posture by degrees. He returned to his work, whatever work could mean now, and let the case become what cases are meant to become, resolved, not erased. Her name still moved through him like a constant, a baseline against which all measurements were taken. Love remained the force that kept him walking toward it. The unthinkable had opened a door and then stepped aside. What mattered was who learned to walk through without breaking the frame.